Thank you for joining the I Am Possible, which is India's first future tech meets sustainability podcast. And today I'm delighted and honored to have with me Mr. Akshay Sujatha Ravindran, who's a data scientist at Alto Neuroscience, a startup which is at the forefront at precision psychiatry medicine. His research focuses on developing different engineering tools for analyzing non invasive electrophysiological data, and Akshay's expertise lies in developing deep learning models to study EEG data with an emphasis on explainability of such models. So, Akshay, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. Why don't we start by explaining what wearable devices are, what brain-computer interface is, and explain, what's the difference between invasive versus non-invasive technologies, and what other capabilities of both.
Yeah, so why don't we start with wearables? So wearables is something I started with on my journey, right? So I think at this point, everyone is familiar with the Fitbit devices that you have. And almost many companies, like the top companies, Apple, everyone has their own. Samsung, they have their own wearable watches. And what that happens is it now has different modalities which measures your physiology, right? So heart rate monitoring is one such common signal that we have in almost all the devices right now. And what this gives us is you have a system that you can wear. So it's not obtrusive. You don't feel that it's something that you have to additionally add in. So it's part of your day-to-day life. And it gives you some context about your physical health, right? So there are many devices out there. So when I was in IIT, we worked a lot with primarily for clinical applications, for heart rate monitoring, blood oxygen levels, like cuffless blood pressure, things like that. Now, these are all based on peripheral signals, so which are not the brain itself, right? It's whatever is from the blood or things like that. Now, in my PhD, I wanted to better understand the functionality of the brain, which is where I joined Dr. Osi Vidal's lab and on BCI. So to put it simply, BCI is a set of systems which translates your thoughts into actions. Like that's a very simplistic way of putting into perspective. Now, that typically involves a few set of systems. Now, we have a set of systems which measure your brain activity, right? That's the primary aspect. So once you have the brain activity measured, that gets translated. Now, you need a set of systems which tries to understand what is there in this signals, right? So there is a side of it. And once the analysis side happens, then you extract the relevant features, put it into a system that can be used for useful purposes. So which could be simple moving your cursor. It could be controlling a robotic arm. It could be an exoskeleton, many things like that, right? So it's a group of systems which come together to achieve these functionalities. Now let's start with the first part, which is part of his follow-up question on the types of non-invasive, invasive recordings. Now, this is very important because the fundamental aspect of BCI is you should be able to pick up signals from your brain. Now, this can be done in many ways. One is called invasive, wherein you need to break open your skull. So there's a craniotomy involved, and you expose your brain and you put some implants inside your brain, right? So there's a surgical process involved. Everyone, I think, would be familiar with this company is called Neuralink at this point. I think that's probably the common ones, but there are many other companies, like, for example, BlackRock. They just have a different invasive BCI. I think that's the most commonly used invasive recordings out there. So that definitely involves surgical procedures. So the good thing about this is it gives you much more signal quality, right? Because you're directly measuring from your brain. So it contains a lot more signal. However, it does come with the issue of its surgical procedure. So there's a lot of risk involved, infections, tissue scarring, things like that. Now, there is another layer on top of it called semi-invasive, which is usually not very common. It's mainly for clinical applications like epilepsy monitoring, things like that, where you'll actually put a sheet of electrodes right on top of your brain, or it doesn't involve any piercing of the brain. So it's like reading right on top of the brain, right? Usually it's called electrocardiography. However, there are a few new innovations in this space. One such company is called Synchron, for example, right? So they have different modalities in which they record the brain activity. through minimally invasive procedures, right? So it's through the veins. That's primarily semi-invasive. And the other aspect is non-invasive, which is very common probably, uh, which is measuring your brain activity without any surgical procedures. Now, there are different ways in which you can do that, right? Let's start with probably the most common and most affordable one, which is called electroencephalography. So what that does is, imagine you have a swimming cap, which is something very relatable for everyone, right? So you have a lot of holes on that swimming cap wherein you put metal electrodes, and the individual wears this cap. And what it does is, these metal electrodes measure your electrical activity from your scalp. So the brain creates different electrical fields, which these electrodes can pick up, and that is completely non-invasive, and it's outside the brain itself, right? Now it's very old technology, but it's coming up again. It's been used a lot. The benefit from this is it's non-invasive, so there's no risk involved, but it does come with the limitation that it's outside your actual like brain itself, so the signal quality is lower, right? Now this is based on electrical activity. Now there is another system called MEG, which is magnetoencephalography. So instead of picking up your electrical field, you can actually pick up the magnetic field produced by this electrical current inside your brain. So this is called magnetoencephalography. Traditionally, MEG used to be in a big unit systems where you need to be in a room and you can't move about in that system, right? But now there's a lot of advances happening in making that technology into a portable form. So there's a lot of interest happening there. Then some of you might be familiar with this term called fMRIs or even MRIs, right? These are structural and functional scans where essentially it's recording indirectly your brain activity. Now, how that happens is you so whenever your brain is involved in certain actions, there is increased blood flow to that region. So this fMRI is essentially reading the increased blood flow. On a similar lines, FNIRS, which is based on infrared radiation, similar to PPG that you have, right? So FNIRS is another system which kind of indirectly measures based on your blood flow. Now, these are non-invasive. So there's no surgery involved, but again, it comes to the limitation that it is having a lower signal to noise ratio, right? So these are three different main aspects, and different companies prioritize each of those modalities.
Right. We are seeing some fantastic innovation when it comes to both mapping as well as reading out your brain data. And you mentioned, there's invasive, non-invasive, and semi-invasive ways, and there's different ways to capture data from EEG, ECG, MEG, fMRI, MRI, and various other means of how to capture our brain data. Now, a human brain, it's one of the most complex organ. 100 trillion synapses, going bonkers the way they fire and wire. It brings about all of our senses. Through all of these technologies that you mentioned, what have been our most current update learnings? And with those learnings, what, according to you, are some of the most practical and best use cases that you would like to share with our audience?
Yeah, so it's, as we know, the BCI is still a kind of novel field compared to any other domains out there. So we are still very early stages, but there are few ways in which we go about doing this, right? So primarily BCI came about with the intent of helping individuals with different disabilities, right? Like people with spinal cord injury or stroke, who have movement disabilities, for example, right? Or with ALS, for example, who cannot communicate. So the original intent behind BCI was trying to help these individuals out, right? There are primarily three ways, I would say, a BCI typically works. One is called active BCI, where the individual tries to engage, so thinks about certain actions, and it actually executes on that particular action, right? Those are active BCIs. Now, to explain that, let's just imagine a very simple action, right? I'm moving my hand, so clenching my right hand. So in your brain, there are certain specific areas focused on specific representations, right? So my hand is represented in the motor cortex, which is like over the center of your head, right? And often the mapping is right hand is on the left side and the left hand is on the right side, right? So whenever I imagine opening my hand or closing my hand or execute the same thing, right? The opposite side of your head, take the example of EEGs, because that's my expertise on. So in EEG, it consists of electrical signals which oscillates at different frequency. Now, there is a particular band called alpha band, which is say 8 to 12 hertz oscillations, right? When the signals are oscillating in that particular frequencies. So whenever I imagine moving my hands, say the right hand, the left side of the head in the motor cortex, the alpha band power kind of drops, right? We call this event-related desynchronization, right? So whenever this happens, from the baseline, there is a dip in your alpha power. Now we can use that to control a BCI. Now, these are active BCI because you actually want to do something, you're actually in thinking of doing it, and the signal can be picked up from the brain. Now, there are certain other paradigms called passive BCIs, where you just record your brain state. There's no particular condition. Just to give an example, it could be detecting your mental state during driving, for example, right? You want to detect drowsiness levels. Now, these are passive, where there's no intent. You're just recording the background activity. That's called passive BCIs. There is also called reactive BCIs. Now, these are external paradigms where you can introduce some response inside your brain. Just to give a basic example, right? I can just look at a screen where it flicks at certain frequencies. So the brain has this thing called frequency tagging or entrainment, wherein the brain starts to pick up that frequency and it starts to oscillate at the same frequency. Now, that is a signal that you can use. Now, there are different other ways like P300 and things like that. I don't want to go into details there, but there are different ways in which people use BCI, right? Now, this has been used for helping people with control different cursors, different prosthetics, different wheelchairs, primarily in non-invasive EEG, but now with the advancement of invasive BCI, there's a lot of promise. The people have converted directly the thoughts into text. So when they try to talk about certain things, they can actually translate that into the text or into actual speech itself, right? So for example, Dr. Shenoy's lab in Stanford, what they try to do is when you imagine actually writing, right? You can actually translate that into the text, and they have very high accuracy, like 90 characters per minute or something with 94 accuracy, right? Similarly, Chang's group, in UCSF, Edward Chang, they did similar thought process. Instead of text, into handwriting, what they do is they attempt to speak and they translate that into vocal cord modulations and then directly into speech, right? So there's a lot of progress being happening in such areas, depending on the applications. So these are some core elements in which BCI has been used.
For my audience who might get a little confused, just to simplify it, it's these electrons which is firing through your neurons, and that kind of gives rise to the language of the brain. And we are trying to understand the language of the brain by reading those electrons firing and kind of mapping it onto the computer with machine learning, deep learning, and so on. And right now we just understanding that basic language. How cool would it be if we completely understand the entire language of the brain, and someday we are able to completely map it? I remember the movie Matrix, and this scene where Neo is in the helicopter, and Trinity wants to understand how to learn the helicopter, and that the learning gets downloaded onto her brain. We are possibly, maybe in the next possibly century or so, maybe when we completely understand the entire cognitive structure, we could be going over there. As humans, we can leverage this tool of technology and go really, really beyond. Now, you are a data scientist, and I think the core of learning what our brain is doing is going to be through data science. you've been vested in explainable deep learning. Would you like to break down and elaborate what that is and how is it being leveraged to understand the human brain better?
As I said, in the BCI, there are different aspects, right? Like one is the signal acquisition, which we kind of talked about. There are different ways to do it. The second is the decoder itself, which is essentially looking for patterns in your brain activity and then translating that into useful signals, which are usually coupled by some machine learning models, right? Now, with the advancement of deep learning, almost all the state of the art has been transitioning to deep learning models. Now, before I explain what the explainability is, maybe I can just talk about an interesting story about how there's something called clever hands. Paul, I don't know if you're familiar with this. So there was this horse in Germany. Its name was Hans, and the idea was everyone thought it's a very smart horse, right? And what it would do, the horse and this trainer would go into places, and it would actually be able to do mathematical calculations. Like, for example, if the trainer says 4 + 4, what is the answer? The horse would actually stomp and just stop at the right point, right? And everyone was so flabbergasted. Like, they were like, "Oh wow, this is awesome," right? And Germany actually had a commission sent to try to investigate the situation. And the preliminary analysis or the report came that it's actually true. They were not cheating, right? However, there was a separate psychologist who actually went and studied the behavior, and what he did identify is indeed they were not tricking, they were not doing anything wrong. But what he noticed is the moment the trainer doesn't know the answer, the accuracy of what the host does drops significantly, or the distance from the host as it increases, the accuracy decreases. Now, what happening there was the host was actually looking into subconscious cues on the face of the trainer, and that is how it would know when to stop actual stomping. So why, and this has been used in psychology, and this has been used now into deep learning as well as something called XAI or explainable AI. And the problems are called clever hands problem because oftentimes these are very complicated nonlinear models. So we don't know what exactly these are doing. So there is a chance that your model is learning from spurious correlations in your data, right? So similar to what Hans was doing, where it was looking into some spurious unconscious thing from the face, it was not actually learning the actual math. It was doing something else, right? So similarly, there is a case that your deep learning model, which is very complex, might be learning from some spurious correlations in your data. So a lot of these problems are called clever hands problem, right? That's one motivation why explainability is very important in this particular models. And it's also critical because imagine you are going to a diagnosis, right? If you have some severe disorder, right? And the doctor asks you that you need to have a surgery. And they say it's based on an AI program, which we don't have any idea how it came to the decision, but we think it's doing the right thing. How confident or comfortable would you be in that thing? Instead, if I'd say, okay, we have an explanation, we kind of know what it's looking for in the data, and that's why we think it's a good decision for you to do it. Now, that gives us a bit more trust in the model, right? Which is also why explainability is very important. And that's why explainability is now getting a lot of interest. It's lagging behind the progress of deep learning. But the way it does is we want to make sure, just to give an example, in my case, EEG, which is non-invasive, it has low signal to noise ratio compared to invasive data. So there's a good chance a lot of what we have is noise, right? So you need to decouple the noise, extract the signal, and use that to control the BCI. And with the deep learning, there's an exponential increase in the adoption of deep learning models. However, less than 1% of the studies use some form of explanation in their study. And what is even more scary is almost 60 to 70% of studies do not handle these artifacts. So that is kind of concerning because usually that's like the go-to step in any BCI development, right? We need to make sure that the noise is rejected. So a lot of what we try to do is, at least in my research, is we wanted to know if the BCI can be impacted by artifacts. And that is critical. And oftentimes one might think that artifacts is always going to help us. So the model might just learn from the artifact, but it's not always the case. It's also the case that your artifact can degrade your performance. So the model might invest a lot in this artifact that it actually forgets the main important signal. So your decoder will also go down, right? So what explainability part of it does is looking for these spurious correlations, trying to make sure it's reading the right aspect. And another way to think about it is deep learning is a data-driven approach, right? So you don't have to hand engineer the features, or you don't have to say, okay, this is a feature that I want to use to do this particular action. It can automatically find it for you. So if we can somehow understand what these models are learning, you might be able to get some insights into some new phenomenon in the brain, right? So that's another exciting avenue that explainability can take us into, right? Yeah, so which is why I'm very excited with the option. So yeah.
You are the data scientist at Alto Science, and Alto Science is working on precision psychiatric medicine. So, would you like to kind of first, make us understand what do you mean by precision psychiatric medicine, and what's your approach at Alto Science?
Definitely. It's a very important question, and let me spend some time. I'm sorry if I'm taking a bit on this, because I think it's important to understand the context first. So in psychiatry, the way currently the diagnosis works is purely based on symptom level, right? So there is a manual called DSM-5, which is kind of like the holy Bible of psychiatry. And the way the diagnosis happens is it's purely based on subjective assessments. So the participants or the patient would come in and say, I have so and so symptoms, and there's a set of scales in which people will ask some questions. And it's purely based on symptom level, right? So if you have like 5 out of 9 symptoms, for example, you'll be diagnosed as having depression. Now, in any other field, like say, for example, diabetes or cancer, you'll always have a biological test associated with it. You'll get some readouts. Based on that, you will know, okay, there is something wrong. So this is what you need to tackle, right? Unfortunately, that is not the case with psychiatry. And what happens is, when you get diagnosed with a particular condition, say, for example, depression, right? There is no way currently for us to know which particular medicine that this individual needs to take. So what we usually do is we give them one antidepressant, for example, and oftentimes it doesn't work. So 1 out 30% is actually the success rate that it works for the first time, for example, right? So what happens? This individual takes a medicine, it doesn't work. So they need to come again, take another one. Maybe that works, maybe that doesn't work. Then they need to come again, try a different one, right? This approach is called trial and error approach. And that has been the case, and that is still the case of how the medicine is being approached, right? And precision medicine, what it looks for is, we consider biology first, right? We bring in biology into this picture where we measure the brain state, for example, the behavior, the genomics, or the activity patterns, right? We try to find patterns in those individuals, and we try to find the right drug for the right individual so that we don't have to go through this trial and error procedures. So this approach is called precision medicine. This has been used in oncology, for example, and we are trying to bring this into the psychiatry per se. Yeah.
Healthcare industry, the way we are treating or the medicines that we're doing is extremely broad. And today, with biology, understanding the genomics, we can narrow it down to a human specific and address it. Okay, this is a specific problem that he has, and create a medicine which works for that specific individual. The psychiatric disorder is huge, and it's not just in elders. And I'm seeing these young kids who are showing up these problems with either depression, PTSD, or schizophrenia. How are you guys helping in understanding, identifying a psychiatric disorder, and how would you eventually, or what's the plan when you say about precision medicine? Maybe narrow it down, give us a little bit more details on what's the future plan on addressing this huge problem.
Yeah, I mean, so it's an important question, right? Because in psychiatry, for example, I mean, if you would think that over time that the burden associated with the disorders will improve or reduce with time, and the care would actually improve with time, right? That has been the case for almost everything: diabetes, cancer, everything. Over time, the burden has been reduced, the care has been improved, right? Unfortunately, that's not the case with mental illness. And even though the amount of investment, the money that is spent, has been growing, the burden has actually going the opposite trend. That's not a good thing to do, and that's a big challenge, right? So in Alto, we put the patient in mind first, and this has been so our work is coming out, emerging from a decade-old research from Stanford. So we've been doing it. Our AI platform has been through different top peer-reviewed journals. So we've been developing different mechanisms in which how we can extract this bio signals. I think there are a few different aspects in which I think Alto stands out from everyone else. I would say one is the approach, which, as I said, in psychiatry, the precision-based approach is very novel. There's basically no one else to compare us to even, right? So we are trying to revolutionize the way in which psychiatry is done. So the approach is different. Then our pipeline, right? So we have 11 clinical assets, which is the largest in the world. And we currently try to look for targeting MDD and PTSD. And we have 3 assets in the clinical phase 2 stage. And I think what is even more important is the leadership. We have very great expertise from people who have in the top biotech companies. And the team itself, we have half clinical development people and half data scientists. So it's a very novel mix, and we have a very hierarchical or very parallel thought process where we inform each other. So we have very passionate people trying to help understand this issue, and we are very hopeful that we'll be able to make a big difference in the how drug development psychiatric is happening.
Right. Yes, I mean, psychiatric disorder is such a huge problem. And besides you, I mean, there's other guys, who are in the field, right from paradromics to precision neuroscience to synchron. Then just recently, I think, I just saw a post by Meron Griffiths, a company which was earlier, he was part of this company called Meta and was fronting augmented reality. And right now, the company is called Inner Cosmos, and they are working on a non-invasive BCI for treatment. Would you like to talk about your current work, your research work in this field, and maybe while you talk about your works, also address like how much do we know about your depression and your schizophrenia and PTSD, and what are the biomarkers? How do we kind of understand what's the, maybe talk about that also.
Yeah, sure. So right now, what we are currently looking for is for predictive signals. So we want to understand which, as I said, the biomarkers, which we want to identify which patient would, which medicine, which particular drug will work best for the particular patient. So that's what we are doing. Now, there is a lot of studies that is happening in this field. The way we try to do is in depression and in PTSD, there are 2 ways, right? One is diagnosis, the other one is like prediction, right? Diagnosis is trying to see, okay, does this individual have depression, right? The other one is, does this individual have, can this particular drug work for a particular individual? Those are 2 separate questions. Now, there are a lot of studies, for example, in schizophrenia, for example, if you have an auditory stimuli, right? There is something called, when you have a 2 stimuli happening one next to the other, right? So the intent is the stimuli that happened right before kind of reduces the action for the succeeding stimuli, right? The response corresponding to that. Now, what we've seen is for schizophrenia, for example, the response is impaired in schizophrenia. That's quite repeatable case, right? In ADHD, for example, there are certain patterns in the brain, the power in different bands, like for example, theta, that's like frequency from 4 to 8 hertz, and beta, which is from, say, for example, from 13 to 30 hertz, right? So the ratio of power in these bands, that's also impaired in this individuals with ADHD, right? So there are certain markers which we've seen to be quite repeatable. And for example, this biomarker in ADHD is FDA approved, right? Like they don't want it to be the sole criterion for diagnosis, but they know that it is kind of repeatable, right? So replicability is an important aspect. We want to make sure that these biomarkers are replicated in large studies. So there are a few measures like that which we can pinpoint into. But oftentimes what happens is we combine multiple biomarkers, right? Multiple features. That's where the sophisticated machine learning models comes into play. So we try to look into aspect of these signals and combine them to make predictive models. That's usually how the modeling procedure is done. So as I said, a lot of what I focused on was explainable AI. So this was important to me because when I joined, it was basically we were riding the BCI deep learning wave. So everyone, because it kind of revolutionized computer vision, natural language processing, etc., right? And we wanted to adopt and as a decoder for our cases as well. And as I said, there was exponential growth in that decoders. And the fact that the number of studies that use explainable methods in them was kind of troubling me. And the amount of studies that do not handle the artifacts was also disturbing. So a lot of my works was trying to understand how the artifacts could actually impact your deep learning models. So my work involved using simulation and actual data, quantifying the impact of the artifacts and how explainability could help us understand this. Another project that I worked on was in our lab, we work with non-invasive BCI, right? So we use electroencephalography to detect the intent, and we use that to control different devices, right? So what we do is a lot of our studies do involve exoskeletons, which are robotic systems, which help us to walk around. And we detect their intent based on the brain activity and control these devices. Now, one limitation with such system is that they have a risk with falling. So if an individual walks on the systems and they fall, it can complicate the repercussions from those devices, right? So my work was trying to see if there are signals in the brain which can do early detection of fall, right? So we did find that there are signals in the brain which are twice as fast, like much earlier than your muscular response or kinematic response. So in early as like 75 to 180 milliseconds, you'll have signals in the brain which you can use for early detection of falls, right? That was part of my work. Another aspect of my work was on non-invasive BCI still, but for motor imagery, which we started a bit us imagining moving my hands, right? If someone imagines moving their hand, there are signals in the brain which you can use for translating into commands. Now, this is called motor imagery, right? And this is probably one of the most hardest BCI paradigms out there, because what we've seen is 15 to 30% of individuals can't even control this BCI. And the reason for that is unknown. And oftentimes what people do is they exclude these participants from the studies. I don't think that's a good way to go about it, because these are individuals who might actually need it, right? So a part of the question that I tried to answer was we want to know using explainable model if there are, we can explain why certain individuals do not, it doesn't work for certain individuals. And people have, one way people try to answer this is, okay, can we aggregate data from multiple subjects and make a robust decoder? That's something called transfer learning. So you use data from multiple subjects and you use a more generalizable model. And what my research attempted to do is, it's not always good to combine everyone's data. So there are different individuals that use certain strategies and some individuals use different strategies. So it makes sense to combine those with that use very similar strategies to instead of using everyone else together, right? So things like that, trying to understand why the BCI doesn't work for certain individuals and why it would work and how best to combine the data from individuals that share similar strategies. So those were certain avenues that I worked on.
What's this early detection of fall? I didn't understand that. So are you saying that there's some kind of a signal which kind of happens in you before you're about to fall?
Yes. So for example, that is the case. So for example, you would think that whenever you fall, the brain kind of responds the last. That's what the assumption was. Like the brain would know at a later point. But what happens is when we measured the brain activity, your muscular response, and your kinematic response, how your body is actually changing the variability of your actual response, right? So what we did see is, and the way currently the detection happens is purely based on kinematic. So when the joint ankle of your leg that actually deviates from the normal trajectory, you detect that, and it usually happens in 350 milliseconds, right? There is muscular response, which kind of peaks at 180 milliseconds. And what we've seen is there is a signal in the brain at around 50, 75 milliseconds called P1 waves. So if I induce perturbations multiple times and I time lock it, which means I align your signals with respect to the event when the perturbation started, you will see that around 50 to 75 milliseconds, there is a deflection, which is time locked to that event, which is called P1 wave. And there is another deflection at around 120 to 180 milliseconds called N1 wave, which is negative going deflection, right? So there is clear signal in the brain at 75 to 180 milliseconds, which is much earlier than your muscular response, which you can actually use to anticipate an incoming fall. So, yeah.
Wow. Okay. You know what? Before I ask this question, I mean, I would like to, speak to my audience and tell them that, technology is neither good, neither bad. I mean, I would largely say that technology is always good because it's something which kind of augments us and has always done and will always do. But yes, there are certain, it really depends upon how you kind of use it. And there are, obviously, will always be through history has and will always be those elements who would want to leverage technology for bad, So brain computer interface, I mean, with it now kind of growing, there's a certain bunch of neuroscientists who are really working hard to kind of understand the brain, what's it kind of saying, its language, and there's computer scientists such as yourself who's kind of trying to figure out a marriage and understanding the language. What happens when we kind of completely understand the human brain, which is, like I said, it's a far out future, possibly a century, I mean, from now. But yes, there are some of the top neuroscientists who are saying maybe like a 50, 60 year horizon where you might possibly understand the human brain. What would be those things which is right on top of your head, which kind of like really scares you? What are the moral and ethical implications you see arising if we do not have a conversation now on collaboration and making sure that this technology is human first?
As much as some of these concerns might be, I do think there's more benefits to be taken. Similar to how FDA looks at anything, right? There's risk and there is benefit, right? I think the benefits outweigh the risk. Because you need to imagine, like, for individual who has different locomotion difficulties, like someone who can't walk, someone who can't communicate, if we can have a technology that partially empowers them, the power that technology offers is immense, right? And I think there is more benefit than the risk associated. And as with any technology, it goes hand in hand, right? You identify a risk, you're going to develop technologies to combat that risk. So there's going to be happening that, but a few things I do think are potentially going to happen, the concern in the space. I think people have already shared some of this concern, because one common thing everyone would say is privacy, right? Like that's probably the one thing that will always stand out. Now, privacy is definitely a concern, but it goes hand in hand with autonomy and who actually has access to the data. I think that will be important, because unlike any other technology, just to imagine, right? Oftentimes when I think about getting an ice cream, I'll get an advertisement in my Google Chrome about an ice cream. Now we get scared just by that. Now imagine the power, what would happen if the thoughts in the brain gets to these companies, right? It's a bit far-fetched. We don't even know if that's possible, but imagining a situation where that is possible, who gets access to the data, that needs to be very highly regulated. I think that will be an important aspect, because unlike we can always decide not to speak in front of Alexa or someone else, right? But we can't do that if it's the thought process, right? Now, again, this is kind of dystopian, so we don't know what's going to happen. Whether it's not whether that's going to happen or not. But say if that is the case, right? I would say privacy and who gets the access to the data is important. The other is autonomy, right? Like who gets to decide the action that they're going to take. So if the brain-computer interface is going to take an action, it's going to detect, who is responsible for those actions? Can we say it's the individual who does that, or is it the company that made a wrong decoding, right? So who is reliable for the consequences, right? So there's a question with that, which I would think is going to be there for any technology, but these are questions which are worth knowing, which we can address. What else? There's always a case like in many of these studies, oftentimes these implants are for temporary use, and they often, after the period ends, they need to take it back, right? There has been cases where people get depressed when they take this amount because they loved it so much, because they've made it's like a revolutionary thing for them, right? So when they take it out, they lead to depression and things like that. At the same time, if the company goes bankrupt, what happens to the actual implant itself? Like, what if it fails? This risk associated with that. So those are some challenges. But I would think we are smart people, so we'll come up with ways to go around this. And I would like to see on top of these problems, because there's so much good that these technologies can do, and I am very hopeful for that, instead of trying to be scared of these concerns.
Yeah, I'm completely with you. Would you like to talk about some of your competitors and some of the peers you really look up to and who are doing cutting edge work in the field of neuroscience?
So I think we are all familiar with Neuralink, for example, right? So Neuralink is probably very common with everyone, which because of the influence of Elon Musk. They do invasive recording, and they target different neurological disorders. At least that's what they initially claim, but they do have plans on cyborg and stuff, which I have some reservations too. But it's a very far-fetched thing, right? Because there are important questions that they will be able to solve. I'm very optimistic with the technology. It's an engineering marvel, because they do have a huge role to play. But I think I am very excited about another company called the BlackRock, because the reason why I think I'm excited is it is actually having the most inhuman testing than any other company, because of almost like 30 plus implants that we have ongoing, long-term implants, most of the implants are from this particular company. So and they recently got an FDA breakthrough device on their BCI called Move Again. So I am very excited with what they are going to be bringing into the table. I think they are going to be a big competitor to Neuralink. There is another company, I mean, Synchron, as you would know, I mean, I am very excited with that, because it's a minimally invasive, unlike all these competitors. So what they do is they do an incision on their jugular vein, and they put something called stent rod, which goes through and sits on the veins on the different motor cortex, and you can detect the signals from there. I'm very excited with what they do. They actually beat Neuralink to the FDA early stage testing. So I'm very excited with that. In non-invasive space, there's a company called I don't remember the company name, but there's a BCI called Ipsy Hand, which actually is the first BCI approved from FDA. It's a non-invasive BCI that is targeting stroke rehabilitation. Very excited, because it's probably the first BCI to be approved. I'm excited with that. There are other non-invasive, for example, Kernel, that's another company. They do FNEARS primarily. I think they're backing out of the MEG more, but FNEARS, I think they are in the space. There are companies like Neurable, which is like a headphone. And why I think these are interesting is these are ergonomic designs. So oftentimes when you hear about BCI, it's this clunky, different big systems, which doesn't look good on you when you go out and stuff. So Neurable actually has like a headphone. So it's kind of, you can merge into the normal day-to-day activity. And they primarily tackle concentration, things like the application, things like that, right? There are other consumer applications like Muse, for example. It's a dry system where they record their EEG and they primarily target meditation. There are some applications like that. Paradomics, as you said, that's a competitor for Neuralink. They have much higher bandwidth. The number of channels are high. But unlike Neuralink, it's like firm electrode. So the scarring, tissue scarring, there's concerns with that. But yeah, there's many more interest in industry, which I'm very hopeful about, because we need industry to advance the field. Academia basically is important to start a new industry, and it's very great that there's a lot of interest in the industry, because this is going to revolutionize the life of many people. So I'm very, very excited about that.
Lovely. Yeah, thank you, Akshay, for taking time and being part of the podcast. Yes, we are sitting in an exciting point of time, and if we nudge the marriage of AI with BCI and everything, I think the entire healthcare industry stands to get upended. And I feel so very good that there's an Indian who's at the forefront of this, so we all very proud that you are at the forefront of fronting a company which is at the forefront with precision psychiatric medicine. There are lots of students and entrepreneurs who are here who would want to know how to get started, if they want to get started in the field of BCI. What would be your advice to them? And paint out the roadmap for Alto Neuroscience. When do we get to clinical stage of testing of the precision psychiatric medicine that you guys are talking about?
Yeah, so I can talk. Let's start with the first question, right? So I think at this time, there's a lot more resource than we used to be, because things like OpenBCI, which is like they've open source their design. So people can actually make EEG systems in India as well, but it never used to be the case, because even as simple as EEG, it was highly inaccessible for most common people. So as I said, open sourcing is important in this area. So there are many, there's something called BCI Guys. There's a YouTube channel. They actually do make a good content on that. So things like that, right? There's a lot more content that is very easily understandable for people. And the best thing to learn is to actually get your hands into it and just try it out. So if you do not have access to the equipment itself, there are many open source data sets out there for neuroscience. You can look into Open Neuro, you can look into scientific data. Even Google has something called Google dataset search. So if you do not have access to the equipment itself, but you want to get, or you're more interested in the analysis side, I would say start with looking into this data sets. There are a lot of GitHub tools if you want some code. So you can actually use that, start exploring some of those things, publish things and create a website, put things there so that you get some exposure. I think that's the best way to start. In terms of our also, we are very excited because we really, really do believe in what we're doing. And we have a very talented team of data scientists and clinical development team, which work day and night to make that a reality, because we need to bring the medicine to the right person, to the right drug as soon as possible. We don't want them to keep on going with the wrong arms. So as I said, we have 11 clinical assets, which is the largest. And we are in phase 2 of that, and we hope to get the readouts of it in the mid next year. So we'll be executing on these clinical goals, and we look forward to the results from that. Yeah.
Lovely. Akshay, thank you. Really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast and sharing your insights. We are sitting in an exciting point of time, and for the first time, I think we saying that instead of being broad-based, can we narrow it down and go to precision medicine? And I think what needs to be addressed is mental disorder, because it's such a huge problem. It's like a virus which is spreading and growing rampantly, and if we do not handle it right now, I think it might just grow beyond our control. So it's great that people such as yourself are at the forefront. So wish you and your team the very best, and I hope that you guys can get to clinical trials and market ready product, so that we can give it out to those patients around the world. So thank you once again for being part of the podcast, and to my listeners, if you like what you see and hear, then please press the subscribe button, and until next time, see you guys. Bye bye. Thank you, Akshay.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.